How does one find a spiritual guide in this day and age? This is a common question which people ask. Al-Imam Ibn Ata'illah Al-Iskandari rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions that when a person proposes to the daughter of a king, he must have a standard himself. You do not go and propose to the daughter of a king with clothes which have excrement. So he states that a person who is looking for a spiritual guide, he must better himself to a standard by which he is able to find such a spiritual guide. What do we have in this day and age? People who do not know ahkam salah, they do not know how to pray properly, they do not know shurutu salah, arkanu salah, they do not even know the dua qunut in the prayer, in the salatul witr. They do not know nawaqidul wudu, what invalidates your wudu. They do not know basic arkanul Islam. They have years of qada of prayer, years of qada. They have the qada of zakat, they miss their zakatul amwal, they do not pay their zakatul amwal. And similarly, we have people who miss fasting in the month of Ramadan, yet they claim that they are finding a spiritual guide. When they do find a spiritual guide, what do they have? Perhaps the spiritual guide will visit the country once a year. Perhaps they will go to visit the spiritual guide. Sometimes the misguidance is to the point that many of them, they actually do sajda to the pir. This is found that there are people who actually carry out sajda to their spiritual guide. Some of them are so misguided, they will do sajda to the graves. Some of them will do tawaf of the graves. Some of them are misguided to the point that they do not rely upon Al-Quran Al-Kareem for their shifa. They perhaps will go to the person for a ta'weed and believe that ta'weed alone will cure them, not resorting to acting upon the deen of Al-Islam, which is praying the 5 daily prayers, as well as the women wearing hijab. So many times you have the women not dressing appropriately and approaching the Pir Sahib. The so-called Pir Sahib will not command the women to dress modestly in accordance with the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, some of them will wear makeup when approaching the Pir Sahib. They will not cover their faces in accordance with the law of Allah. They will not dress appropriately, and they become misguided. Sometimes and many times the Pir Sahib, a person will spend decades with such a guide. They will not even learn the basic sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will not even learn the attributes of Allah. There are so many people in our community, they have spent years and years with a pir. The pir has not instructed them even in the basic sifat of Allah. And even if he does, many times the person will misguide them in other aspects of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this day and age, a person must be careful in terms of isolation, where women are isolated with the pir, where incidents may occur. Khalwa between a man and woman, which is haram in the Sharia of Allah. If the woman is not related to you, you cannot have khalwa with that woman. But likewise, the misguided pirs, they will misguide people with regard to ilm. So many of the murids, people who are students, are never encouraged into entering al-ilm al-sharif, to studying ilm correctly. So many of them have many vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned, one of those vulnerabilities is the case of women. What is a ghair mahram? A mahram, firstly, a mahram is someone you can never marry. A ghair mahram is someone you can marry. It is impermissible for a man to be alone with a woman who is ghair mahram, a man and woman in isolation. A man cannot stay with her alone behind closed doors. Totally prohibited in the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And chuf chuf pir is an ailment of an illness in our community. Such an ailment that if it is not rooted out, if the bid'ah in our community is not rooted out, you will only have the likes of Ali Mirza Engineer, and the misguided people growing in number because they misguide people with regard to the real meaning of tasawwuf, the real meaning of real Sufi guides. In this day and age, a person does not need to take bay'ah with a person. It's not essential. What is essential is firstly in aqeedah to have correct belief. After correct belief, firstly you cannot blind follow, you cannot do taqleed in aqeedah of a modern person. When you follow the Quran and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is not deemed taqleed. If you ask someone, why do you believe in this, and he responds with a verse of the Quran, that is not taqleed. If you ask them, why do you believe in this, and they respond with a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is not taqleed. Taqleed is that when your peer becomes misguided, you become misguided with him. That is real taqleed. That is totally impermissible. We have false peers within the UK informing their murids that taqleed in aqeedah is permitted. This position has never been established in the books of ilmul kalam. That taqleed, meaning it's qawl marjuh, it's not permissible to do taqleed in aqeedah of these individuals. So the first step to guidance is having the correct belief, the belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The second step to guidance is following one of the four madhahib, al-madhahib al-arba'a. You either follow the Hanafi school or the Shafi'i school or the Maliki school or the Hanbali school in your fiqh positions, following one of the schools of fiqh. And then when it comes to tasawwuf, a person takes guidance from the works of those ulama who have passed away, like Ihya Ulum al-Din of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali or Tanbih al-Mughtarrin of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, and these type of books. A person increases in istighfar and salawat and salam upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this day and age, as Imam Abu al-Abbas al-Mursi rahimahullah ta'ala states, in akhir al-zaman, spiritual guides will be difficult to find, meaning the person needs a certain level of qualification to have a superb Sufi guide. But to reach that level of qualification, the means of attaining that is through iltizam sharia, following the sharia, which is only according to one of the four madhabs, and then increasing in salawat and salam upon the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. This is such a guide that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam said, "Man ra'ani fil manami faqad ra'a al-haq." Whoever saw me in a dream, he has indeed truthfully observed me. And وَمَنْ رَآنِي فِي الْمَنَامِ فَسَيَرَانِي فِي الْيَقَظَةِ. Whoever observes me in their sleep, he shall observe me in a wakeful state. Authentic Sahih Hadith. This means Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the ultimate guide for the people, even in Akhirul Zaman, in this time. Following the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then increasing your salawat and salam upon the best of creation is your guide in this day and age. A person does not need a peer, because the peer culture today is corrupted. In fact, you have people who are not ulama claiming to be peers, but they can fool the general public that they are ulama, but they will avoid sitting with real ulama. Some of them cannot even recite a page from Sahih al-Bukhari and explain the page from Sahih al-Bukhari. Some of them will not know the Quran with qira'atu hafs, with tajweed. Many of them will not be able to even give a fiqh ruling, a ruling correctly from a madhab. This person is not a guide. A person who does not have these basic qualifications is not a guide. But even if a person is able to do that, they must fulfill the criteria as set out by the likes of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani rahimahullah ta'ala, which are found in his book Tanbih al-Mughtarrin. A person should read that book, Tanbih al-Mughtarrin. The Talabatul Ilm should read that book. The ulama, the mashayikh should sit down and read that book with their students, so we know the guidelines of a real person who follows the way of as-salafu salihun, the pious predecessors. That book is full of the conditions that are needed for a person to guide people. If a person claims to be a guide, today a Sufi guide, he must fulfill those conditions. Those conditions which are set out in Tanbihul Muqtarreen. This is why I mentioned to many of those who claim to be Pir up and down the UK that when you interact with me, I will bring up those conditions of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani. This is our right. Meaning the haqq of al-ilm is that you fulfill those conditions. If you make a claim today of being al-Ghawth, you claim to be al-Qutb, you claim to be Abdal, you claim to have a spiritual rank, then we will take you and measure you in accordance with the conditions laid down by awliyaullah as-salihun, like al-Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani rahimahullah ta'ala. If a person makes a claim, he will be tested according to that claim. Wal-iyadhu billah. So, chuf, when he comes to the UK, our public must be warned with regard to the scam, the fleecing that is occurring. People need guidance on looking after their health. They need guidance with regard to nutrition. They need guidance with regard to their mental health. They need guidance with regard to Al-Quranul Kareem and taking cure from Al-Quranul Kareem, taking the shifa from Al-Quranul Kareem. Now, many of the huffaz, the memorizers of the Quran, they worry with regard to reciting ruqya on the sick people. They should not desist from reciting ruqya on the sick people. They should recite ruqya upon the people who are sick in accordance with the sunnah and the guidance of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Additionally, when you have ruqya recited upon you, so many people, they take their women folk to the spiritual healers. And when they take their women folk to the spiritual healers, firstly, the women are not dressed in hijab. Some of them, they wear makeup. And many times they leave the women isolated with the pir. And this leads to the scandals that we hear about in our community. So many scandals that occur between the pir, the spiritual guide, and the murid. But that can be deterred if our public was educated in terms of the deen of al-Islam. That everyone today who complains about an abuse case, well, you should have known the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is with regard to adults. They should know with regard to the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit? What does the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid? For instance, women wearing inappropriate clothing, revealing clothing in front of the Pir Sahib. Totally haram. The woman should be wearing an abaya, a loose overgarment that covers the contours of the body, and be wearing scarves that cover the entire hair, as well as a face veil. And if there is no need to go in front of this so-called pir, the women should not actually be meeting these pirs. But some of the men folk, they take their women to spiritual healers, and it leads to abuse cases across the country. Not only within the UK, but across the entire Muslim world, wherever this may occur. So there are guidelines laid out by the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a reason. And chuf pir is just one element of the pir culture. This pir culture today, the Wahhabi movement needs the false pirs to validate itself. Let me repeat that again. The Wahhabi movement, the Najdi movement, the pseudo-Salafi movement requires the pir cultural movement to validate its claim of bid'ah and shirk upon Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. As long as there is a promotion of this false pir culture, Wahhabism will grow. Because when you have bid'ah, when you have innovation in the practices of people, when you have lack of iltizam, lack of application of Sharia, when you have the proliferation of ignorance amongst the masses, when you have these cultural problems, then a person claiming to follow the Quran and Sunnah, people will follow him, because he is pointing out an internal cancer which is found in the body of those cultural Muslims. Those cultural Muslims who may prostrate to a pir, cultural Muslims who have a jahil pir. Sometimes they may stay with the jahil pir for decades and they will not realize he's actually a jahil. He's a person who is actually very ignorant. Some of them are very ignorant and do not fulfill the shurut of an actual guide. And as I mentioned the work of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, Tanbih al-Muqtarrin, but he has another work, Mawazin al-Qasirin min Shuyukh wa Muridin. And Imam Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, rahimahullah ta'ala, he has Uddatul Murid Sadiq, preparing the truthful murid. Never mind a truthful guide. By the way, there are always awliyaullah salihun